Peter Defty, it's awesome to have you here on Live Your Own Fit podcast. As owner of Vespa, the amino acids that help you burn more fat for fuel, and also just a long-time coach and mentor for many, many athletes in terms of getting them to use fat more efficiently through your fat optimization. Optimized Fat Metabolism, OFM is your catchphrase. But I'm going to just start out with a good question, and it's basically not a question, it's just a quote that you always say, and that's, it's not what's in your blood, it's what you're burning. And can you just elaborate on that and take us straight into your speciality?
Okay, so when I say it's what's in your blood, I think we'll change that. It's not just what's in your blood and what you're burning or what you're seeing. When we do when people do blood tests or they're monitoring their glucose and lactate, these are proxies. That's what's in your blood at the time. So you have to take it a step further. And people tend to, use those numbers as sort of absolutes when they're really something to interpret with a lot of other variables, including other blood variables. I mean, it's just like, people have to always remember that when you're doing a blood test, whether it's a glucose and lactate test while you're on the bike, testing yourself in training, or you're doing a blood panel for the doctor for your physical, that is what is in your blood at that time. And then you have to sort of interpret and extrapolate from there based on a whole bunch of stuff.
Yeah. So basically it's difficult to get solid answers, but in terms of when we're exercising and eating more glucose, putting more glucose into your blood system, or eating more fat, for example, and putting more fat into your blood, doesn't necessarily change what's happening at the muscles, but it can. Or if there's high ketones don't necessarily mean that you are burning heaps of ketones.
That's exactly right.
A few of those things that don't equate to how the energy is being produced.
Right. That's exactly it. Like I'll give you two really good ones. And the first one is, as you mentioned, ketones. What we've seen in really well fat adapted athletes is they tend to run lower ketones when they're fasted and not exercising. And they tend to run lower ketones when they're exercising compared to a sedentary person who's practicing strict nutritional ketosis. They will turn up higher ketones in certain situations, but that's not always the case. They just tend to run trace ketones like 0.05 to 1 millimolar instead of the 2 to 3 millimolars or 1 millimolar up that are typically seen in a nutritional ketosis diet. And conversely, and this goes back to this whole concept of optimizing fat metabolism, is conversely, a lot of fat adapted athletes, depending on their training load and the kind of training kind of training they're doing at the time, will show really high glucose levels in their blood. And like particularly a fat adapted athlete, if they hammer their workout at the end and track their blood sugar post-exercise, they'll see a marked glucose spike. Like some people doing fasted workouts, just Vespa and fasted. They'll hammer at the end and they'll see a spike of their glucose up to 200 milligrams per deciliter, which is the American. I can't remember what the millimole equivalent is, but that's a pretty sharp spike. And it's very common to see a lot of athletes go 150 to 200 post-exercise, which that glucose gets shunted into muscle glycogen afterwards. But that's actually, you have to think it through. It's actually showing that your fat metabolism is working well, because what that is hepatic production of glucose through glucagon signaling, and your liver's making glucose to meet that metabolic demand of really high intensity pushing at that point.
Yeah, and I've experienced that a lot.
Yeah.
I've experienced the low ketones, and I've always had low ketone numbers, which years ago when I started testing was very frustrating, because at that point, all the podcasts I listened to basically said you're not in ketosis if you're not at 0.5. And I was like pulling my hair out and sculling MCT oil and trying to push my ketones high.
And then you found me.
Yeah. And then I realized that it doesn't equate to that. And then I also have experienced going out and doing a threshold effort on the bike and testing my blood glucose afterwards. And it was, let's say it was high 5. So that's what you were talking about. In our numbers, I had about 5.7 or something from memory. When really people would think, oh, hang on, if you've been burning your glucose, your glycogen in your muscles, and you're lowering your blood glucose through a hard effort, normally your blood sugar would then drop, and that number would be below 5. It could even be 4. But yeah, that's not what happens at all when you're doing that hard effort. The hormones tell the liver to release more glucose into the blood. And so it's amazing how well a fat-adapted athlete can replenish their glycogen stores without actually eating any carbohydrates.
That's exactly right. And if people don't understand that, when you're making all that glucose from your liver stores, it's actually fat, and that's part of that whole model of fat optimization. It's not just about burning fat, especially like the MCT oil people. I don't want people using a lot of MCT oil because it's really about tapping into your own body fat, really, and it's to burn it through beta oxidation, which is what I call that base load fuel, where you've got that steady thing, and then you have ketones and glucose from your liver, and then you have glycogen and exogenous carbohydrates, and maybe some ketone esters thrown in there. That external fuel to so really top it off.
Sources. Yeah. I mean, and then you've got other recycling sources as well, which, I mean, I'm not even aware of them all, but the lactate and pyruvate and all these amino acids and other things that your body is producing in that cycle of energy production, it produces other things that can be recycled.
That's exactly right. But the point there is you want to minimize that recycling. And that's why having too much protein that's a metabolic load, converting too much protein into sugar, right? You
mean during training?
During training and exercise. You want to have enough, but you don't want to have too much. Same thing with lactate. The reason lactate's a perfect example of what's in your blood. And lactate's always been a marker for fatigue, because as you see lactate goes, you get the muscle soreness, and people correlated, they talk about lactic acid and lactate, but lactate is, the byproduct of burning glucose. So the pyruvate gets converted into acetyl-CoA, gets fed into the Krebs cycle, make energy, but the lactate gets spun off. Now, your heart, your liver, your kidneys, they know how to use lactate, but there's a certain rate, there's a rate that the heart can use lactate efficiently, but then once it exceeds that rate and has to start to recycle it, that puts an extra metabolic load on the body that you really don't want to use for when you're training and racing.
But could you also say that extra load isn't necessarily the lactate, but it's the cycle, the energy production that caused the lactate, which is in a low oxygen state. So the fact that, the lactate's produced in a more anaerobic state, which produces more free radicals and more oxidation. So it's problem at the mitochondria level, which also causes the lower efficiency of energy production. So,
well, it's manifold, because you're when you produce excess lactate past the rate of lactate absorption of the various systems, you start to see the lactate levels rise, correct?
Yeah.
So then the body has to recycle, and that creates a lot of extra metabolic monkey work. But as you say, with that comes the oxidative stress. With that, you're operating at a level at that time where your mitochondria are sort of maxed out, and they're in a hypoxic state, and I can't remember, there's these super complexes within the mitochondria have folded into this hypoxic state to try to make do with what oxygen they have. So they're going to go more glycolytic than fat-based. And so it becomes a very nuanced and mixing. So I don't want to lose anybody, but
yeah, we'll just say it's basically there's less oxygen and you're using more sugars.
Well, yes, but I'm going to take it a little further. Let's go into this. And this is another
basic.
No. But there's some things people should be listening to here about this that have to do with optimizing your fat metabolism. You're absolutely correct, and people should note that. But I've got a big but. When you optimize your fat metabolism, the other half of fat metabolism, we're always burning fat. It's just that if we have a bunch of carbohydrate, we burn a lot less fat. We burn a lot more carbohydrate. But the other end of it is not just a energy thing. It's a metabolic physiological machinery thing, because fats, lipoproteins, cholesterol, those are the building blocks for all your cells, your mitochondria, your hormones, your enzymes, your cell walls. Everything is based on a fat-based metabolism. Okay, glucose is just a quick energy source. It's your fight or flight energy source. Okay, so this other half is what builds mitochondria. And as you've seen in your journey, Pete, when you build that fat burning machinery, you're going to build more mitochondria. So when you go into that more hypoxic state, you got more mitochondria that can be a whole lot more efficient with that glucose, because you haven't burned up your mitochondria by burning a lot of sugar.
Yeah.
And that's a big thing people don't understand, that there's this indirect benefit that's huge when it comes to burning sugar.
Okay.
I know. Yeah, I know. I'm losing you too. but that's the thing. It's like there's a lot of talk about mitochondrial health, and this is the big one. Is you want to make big, healthy, and numerous mitochondria within your cells, and it's done on fat. It's not done on glucose. People, glucose tends to put a lot of stress through oxidation.
So if we put this in practical terms, the building the aerobic base in, let's say, that cycle of training phase, which is early on and long, and it's the long and slow, as people would say. I mean, talk us through some of the adaptations that need to be that happen in that period.
Well, yeah, it's, and this is another thing. I just had a blog go out on this. You start with that, get fat adapted, right? Physiologically fat adapted by cutting out the carbs and changing so your body wants to burn fuel. And we start with an aerobic base phase of 2 to 3 weeks, right? Where you're easily building that base up. But
Which
then
2 to 3 months for some.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there's a lot of things to figure out. Just as an aside, there's a lot of things to figure out with fat metabolism. It's not, glucose metabolism works great because you shotgun a bunch of glucose, you're giving your body a lot of fight or flight fuel, which it has to burn. I mean, as Steve Finney and Jeff Volek call it, it's the metabolic bully, because it goes to the front of the energy line. Your body has to burn it or you die. This is why type 1 diabetics have to take insulin when they bolus with carbs, because if they don't get that insulin to drive it into the cells and burn it off, it goes nuclear on them, literally.
And one of the factors is that a high blood sugar level will actually shut down the fat burning
And
metabolism.
that's exactly right.
And is that during exercise as well as at rest?
Well, as you get more fat adapted, as you build more mitochondria, that impact becomes less and less. And then of course, the carbs become more like rocket fuel. When you're first starting out, if you start doing that, you're still haven't got your insulin down, your body hasn't really reset. Absolutely. So when we're going into this base building phase of you want to build up that thing, because that creates a lot with that fat-based physiology. It's fundamentally different. Cardio is fundamentally different because now you're feeding it with a sustainable one. You're taking away the oxidative stress and the inflammation that goes with burning a lot of glucose. And so cardiovascular training on a fat-based physiology is fundamentally different. And because, as I said, optimized fat metabolism has this back end in terms of generation, you start to generate a lot of capillary and microcapillaries. These are the last feeder lines to your muscle cells. And you want to build a lot of capillaries and microcapillaries to feed blood in and out of the muscle cells. And so once you get
and the
that
oxygen as well.
Absolutely. The oxygen in, the CO2 out, the waste products, and also the heat for thermal regulation. And so when you take that inflammation away, you're not only getting more mitochondria, or not just mitochondrial biogenesis, but capillary and microcapillary biogenesis. But your veins, arteries, and capillaries and microcapillaries, also their distensibility. And that's the ability for those vessels to grow and be flexible and pliable and actually move more blood much more comfortably. They actually work better, because when you have a lot of glucose, you get inflamed, your blood pressure goes up. And that's why, a high carb diet combined with salt makes your blood pressure go through the roof, because those arteries, veins, and capillaries are stiff. When you're on a fat-based one, they become soft, pliable, and grow, so you can deliver a lot more volume of blood to the cells in and out for oxygen and nutrition, and then get that CO2 waste and heat back out. Okay. Yeah. So that's really key. Now, to take it one step further, once you have that base built, then you got to bring in the high intensity interval training and tempo training in a periodized fashion in conjunction with the long stuff, the lower intensity. It's like, sort of like 80-20. 20% should be in the upper zones, including some really high, super high intensity, because you need that short, sharp stimulus to give your body that adaptive stress.
Neurally, for the nerves to fire and actually connect the entire muscle. Yep. I kind of usually just use the example like, well, if you're only ever switching on 50% of your muscle, you're only ever training 50% of your muscle.
That's exactly right. For the muscle twitch, the fast to get the speed up, and also to signal to the body it has to get better and more efficient at burning both sugar and fat. And so that at that point is when you start driving up your fat oxidation rate into the 75, 85, 80% of your VO2 max, that sweet spot for triathlon racing. And so then, using glucose or, whether it's glycogen or an exogenous source, really makes it like rocket fuel, because once you can cruise on fat at 75 to 80% of your VO2 max, then all of a sudden that last 20-25% can be sustainably fueled by exogenous glucose and glycogen.
Yeah. And so if we talked about the crossover point, which is people can in a lab test how much they're burning fat or glycogen as the effort gets harder and harder, and the crossover point where you go from burning more fat than you are glycogen, and as the effort gets harder, that ends up being more glycogen, less fat, and you get this crossover point as the graph goes across horizontally. And the point with becoming better fat adapted is that crossover point moves further along the graph. So the intensity is higher and you're still using a lot more fat. Is that right?
Well, it's two things. It's actually a compounding thing, because as the faster study showed, and I'll send you some graphs you can post if you want. The classic George Brooks crossover was a well-trained endurance athlete would cross over around 65% of their VO2 max. You'd agree with that, right?
Yeah.
In the faster study, they showed that it moved up to that 75 to 80% of VO2 max. But here's the kicker. Combine the crossover shift with the huge increase in fat oxidation, right? Because the high carb diet cohort and faster, they were burning about 0.65, just over a half a gram of fat a minute. Peak oxidation was the high carb guys, the conventional guys. They were only burning like half, and they crossed over right about 65, 70, 67% of VO2 max. I think it was 65%. So right in line with the existing science. Okay. The low carb diet cohort, they pushed their VO2 their crossover up to 75, 80% of VO2 max, but instead of burning like 0.65 or 0.67 grams a minute, they were averaging 1.54 grams a minute.
And my question is for the listeners, tell us why that matters in terms of the stress that you're inducing for an endurance athlete, how does that benefit them towards the back end of a race?
Well, it benefits them all through the race, right? The back end is when people start to pick people off because you're just not as depleted, right? And you can still go hard.
Depleted, or there's just less stress accumulated as well?
Both. You're less depleted. You haven't had that cumulative stress of all that oxidative stress, the lactate load, all the things that go with burning a lot of sugar. And so you end up, I mean, it's just that combination of moving the crossover point into that sweet spot and being able to burn 1.5 times more or 2.3 times more fat over glucose. It just shifts that energy substrate load to where you're tapping into your own body fat. And that's key to understand, because a lot of the keto people, they tell you to do fat bombs and MCT oil. And I say, no. That's not even people from who are like promoting this do that in races. You know, they might promote products that have it, but they don't use that on race day because it doesn't work for them. And like MCT oil, that literally will come out go right through you.
So that's a good question that I've got for you is, there are products as well as just off the shelf products like MCT, but then there's also specific sports products that have fat in them. Mm-hmm. Is there any benefit in any research that you've seen on eating fat during an endurance effort when you are going relatively hard? So let's talking about Ironman, where you are going at like 80% of your VO2.
Yeah, you're racing.
Is there, your heart rate is above math, but you're up at your aerobic threshold for most of the day. What's the benefit to having fat? Is there any?
Here's the point that the listeners need to get. You need to tap into burning your onboard fat. That's the whole point of fat burning. Is evolution made us to where we feasted when we made a kill or fruit was ripe. It got converted to fat, and then we went out and hunted. Like I say, primitive man didn't get up in the morning, make himself a bowl of oatmeal, grab a couple of gels, and go hunting.
No.
Right?
So there's no
benefit for
even
racing.
Fat adapted, no.
Right. If you're going out for a long, slow training day just to really put time on feet or time on the bike, because you're not pushing yourself to the point where the digestive load of trying to metabolize and digest fat is that high. You really need to keep when you're racing, especially if you're racing in the heat and humidity, your body is the resources are going to your muscles to perform, and then the blood's going from the muscles to the skin surface to thermoregulate, to cool those muscles, to keep the mitochondria from burning up. So there's a lot of hydration issues. Your digestive tract is basically put on sleep mode, right? So you can't digest. So I always suggest simple sugars and really focus on hydration, getting the right mix of salt and sodium and electrolytes, other electrolytes, so that both the fluid from the mix of water and electrolytes plus the carb calories you're taking in will transit the stomach and gut osmotically, just through the osmotic potential. So there's no digestive Mickey Mousing going around, because a lot of products, because of this shutdown, a lot of stuff, if you take too much carbs in, it might start to ferment because it's not able to transit the gut. And then you got real problems.
And you can't, the osmosis level, like if you've taken on a higher percentage of carbohydrates, and let's say in the heat of an Ironman in Hawaii, your osmosis rate may have dropped to 3 to 4% of how dense for people to try and explain this is just how dense a liquid is with molecules. Yep. So you can make it dense with electrolytes, carbohydrates that are diluted in water. But as you add more carbohydrates, that increases the percentage of molecules in the water, so you can't absorb it across your intestinal barrier because A, it's hot and your body's under stress, and B, the current osmolality of your blood where it's trying to get into has changed over the course of the race. And
that's correct.
Can you take us through your kind of take us through an Ironman in Hawaii, what you would be drinking when and why as the race progresses.
Well, and you hit the nail on the head there, Pete, because it is a moving target. And I've said this, it's just so dynamic that people have to be willing to experiment, make mistakes in training, and learn to do this intuitively, because there's so many variables that we can, you and I can armchair a simulated Ironman, but we don't know what'll happen. Like,
you can't practice an Ironman in Hawaii.
You can't practice it. Yeah. And with several high-level triathletes I've coached, literally I've had to have them go out and do training in the heat and make those big mistakes so they know what they're up against.
It's almost like you need to know what it's going to feel like before it gets worse, I guess.
Right. And it's what I call a slow bonk, because it'll start to come on like a bonk, like a slower bonk. But the problem is, if you get behind on your hydration, it can take hours to recuperate. It's not like a blood sugar bonk where you hit a gel and you're back to normal. Hydration bonk, because what happens is sodium controls extracellular fluid, potassium controls intracellular fluid. But when you start to get low on sodium, you start to pull potassium out. Then you get all this mineral imbalances, and the body's compensating. It becomes messy real fast. And then the cells don't function. So it's really about staying on hydration and making sure that osmolarity is just right so that the fluid can transit the stomach and gut quickly and efficiently, so that you can maintain a high rate of performance, because as you're transiting that fluid in, it's going right out as sweat, right? In terms of a simulated Ironman, what I always recommend, because when you're a fat adapted athlete, to start with, those swings, and you probably notice that the swings in water weight, fluid weight, like if you weigh yourself before a workout, weigh the fluid you took in, and weigh yourself after, it's very common for a male athlete to see anywhere from 7 to 12 pounds of fluid weight shift in a 2 to 3 hour workout in the heat, right? Because you're just sweating gobs of fluid. So that being said, your body knows how to keep reserve. So in an Ironman, what I suggest people do is, unless it's like super hot and humid, don't hydrate until you get a good sweat going. I like to see a lot of athletes lose at least 1% of their body weight, which means you got a good sweat going before you start to rehydrate, because we always carry a little extra. And I think the intuitive thing I want people to pay attention to is when you go out and run or bike, you just kind of feel sluggish for an hour or so. And then all of a sudden things kind of kick in because you're carrying that extra fluid. And once you get a good sweat going and all the hormonal and enzymatic pathways are upregulated, then things going. Then you just got to feed it with your hydration. And then depending on what you're doing and at what level, add some carbohydrates. And that's why when you optimize your fat metabolism, it reduces the need for those external carbs. And as you so accurately said, the more carbs you have to put into that mix, the more it's going to impact that osmolarity and ability of that fluid to transit the stomach and gut, both for hydration and calories. And so like over a Ironman, what I suggest people do is they, like Hawaii, you do the swim, you would get on the bike and get going, just take a swig of something, nothing big, and settle in to the bike before you start any kind of feed, whether it's water or hydration. And again, it's dependent on the day, right? And as you go,
if we start about what's happened in the swimming is fairly low energy requirements because of, you're supported by the water. There's no impact. The heart rate may have been high, but let's say that's only been for the arms a little bit. So
plus the thermal transfer of energy, the heat regulation from the water is so much higher than in the air.
So let's say in the swim, you've used your arms. Maybe you've used a little bit of the glycogen that was stored in your arm muscles if you went hard enough, but really you haven't used a lot of energy, or you haven't created a lot of stress So there's no real need to suddenly have a heap of carbohydrates after the swim.
Absolutely not.
So that I'm just trying to paint the picture of why you don't need eat straight away. And then, take us through the bike then.
Right. So you want to get settled in on the bike. So you do the swim, get settled in on the bike, and look for what I call the switch. And that's that point where your body's like, oh, okay, I can go hard all day rather than struggle through, because you do the swim, like you say, it's glycolytic. It's the start of the race. You come into the transition, you're scrambling, right? And I always have people pop a Vespa Junior as a little booster, so they get a little bit of orange juice hit of carbohydrate, and they get a little extra of the wasp extract. But then get out and get settled in on the bike in at least 20 minutes. I like to see people get anywhere from 45 minutes, half hour to 45 minutes before they start a feed, because you want that hormonal and enzymatic signaling to say, oh, we have a high energy demand now. We got to ramp up, because blood sugar and glycogen are that bridge fuel from going from a static state to an active state, right? And so whether you're training or racing, you always want to look for that switch, because that's when things have ramped up to where your body's internally supplying the fuel. Then once you have that locked in, then you can start a feed, right? And that's when it's appropriate. And like if you're doing a Kona, you get out of the water, you're going, get settled in. I say try to do your feeding somewhat early once the switch is well in, like 10, 15, 20 minutes after you feel that switch go, then start a feed, because it's virtually impossible to get knocked out, right?
And because, as we mentioned earlier, one was when you go hard, you can actually increase your blood glucose in a training session without eating. But the inverse can happen, where when you are doing a long and slow, or even at an Ironman pace heart rate potentially, you can drop your blood sugar. So you kind of have the two ends of the spectrum. A harder the effort, your blood sugar goes up, but the more moderate the effort, over time you can drop your blood sugar, which is one of the reasons why having a little bit of carbohydrates throughout an Ironman is good, just to keep your blood sugar at that kind of base level.
Right, because the glucose will get burned first, and you're absolutely right, because a well-adapted athlete, they'll burn most of their energy will come from beta oxidation, and secondarily from ketones, from ketosis, because ketones burn cleaner than glucose. Beta oxidation burns cleanest and most sustainable, and then you'll be making ketones. And like you say, you get into that submaximal effort, you might be producing a fair amount of ketones, but you're simultaneously burning them, right? So you'll have low ketones, low blood glucose, and then just adding a little bit of easily transited simple sugars, carbohydrates that pass well. And once again, athletes should experiment to find out what works for them.
Because I guess there's so many areas where you are using the blood sugar, like it's dropping because you're using your brain, you're using your diaphragm, you're using your muscles as well. So there's so many areas of energy uptake during a race.
That's exactly true. And the reason I'm saying to start a feed fairly early is the cooler it is, before it gets hot, you want to try to get a few calories in you, because once it gets hot, then you want to change your nutrition strategy to focus on hydration and just get the calories down to a minimum. Like in the heat, if it's a hot, windy Kona, you're going to be doing all you can to get 100 calories an hour into you effectively, and to be able to race at optimal energy, power output levels in the
because of the stress on the body.
Yes.
The stomach and intestines are going to not be able to
they're on sleep mode. They're in sleep mode because your body's trying to thermoregulate. And that thermoregulation is at that critical phase if you're racing, right?
So talking about that osmolality and the difference in blood volume, is that something that you consider?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why when I talked about earlier about a fat-based physiology, this is another benefit of a fat-based physiology. When you have that distensibility of the arteries, veins, capillaries, and microcapillaries, they're soft, you can handle more blood volume. And it's going to allow you to thermoregulate. And I don't know if you've noticed, but since you started to be fat adapted, particularly when you're using the Vespa, you can sweat heaps, like, I mean, buckets. And so if you're putting out that much fluid and electrolytes, you need to be replacing them too. And so it becomes critical, and you can easily do it. It's just, but I think at that point, everybody knows to get enough water in them. They don't realize just how much sodium is required. They do require other trace electrolytes. I'm not saying you don't, but like 80 to 85% of somebody's sweat, the electrolyte profile is just sodium as salt. That's why sweat tastes salty. And again, it's a moving target. As you adapt, especially if you're in Kona shape and you've done heat training and all that, your body's going to adapt to conserve electrolytes, so it's not going to put out as much. So like, you know, here in the States, when you do your spring training in March and April and you hit a hard day, all your kit is caked with white salt. But then by August, it's nothing because your body's adapted, right? So it's really about maintaining that. And then that's where you kind of go to a trickle of sugar. And if you can, and one of the best things you can do is if you have your, you know, what your special needs table, if you can get whatever your bottles are super cold, that's going to help because you're going to be internally cooling yourself. That's going to make a huge difference.
Yeah. And so another thing that can occur with getting better fat adapted and changing the way that you eat and train is what happens to sodium, both in how you can store it. So you might actually have higher stored levels of sodium, and then the way that you sweat it out. Is that right?
Yeah. Here's the thing, and I'll give some people some tips. Okay. One of the main things that I see that's a problem is to do that is you store a lot of sodium in your liver and in your bones, along with other minerals. And this is one of the things I think why people feel, you know, your standard high carb athlete feels depleted at the end of a season, because we've been so scared of using salt that we're not using enough. And so the body compensates by pulling it out of the liver and bones. And by the end of the season, you just feel frail. And why, even though a lot of athletes are out in the sun all summer, they still have brittle bones because they're just depleting those minerals. So that being said, you need to be replenishing it regularly, but with athletes not understanding just how much electrolytes they need, two of the worst things they can do to impact their storage is prehydrating before an event. You know, trying to drink a lot of water. You see people drinking water, and all they're doing is going to the loo, right? You know, 20 minutes later, they got to go to the loo and pee. And what they're doing is because you got excess fluid, you just drink to thirst because you don't want to create a situation where you're constantly having to excrete fluid, which means your body has to compensate by pulling electrolytes out of the liver and bones to do that. And then all of a sudden, those easily accessible reserves that you need for racing, right, are gone. And that's why a lot of people who do this, they find themselves kind of not being able to perform on race day because they're hydrating 48 hours before and right up to the start. Don't do anything. Your body has homeostasis. It self-regulates your fluid balance. And once you're adapted and you have it down, you're going to be fine. And just like I said, wait till you lose 1 to 2% of your fluid before you start a feed, unless it's super hot and humid where you just start, you know, sweating heaps from the get-go, right?
And one thing I've noticed, obviously everybody says when you first start going low carb, you really do need to up your electrolytes, sodium and magnesium particularly. But over time, you know, I found that I was just going to the loo every night. And so I've actually reduced my sodium intake, particularly when I'm not doing, you know, I'm not currently doing 5 hours of training in the heat. So I'm not sweating a hell of a lot. But I've reduced my sodium, so I'm no longer going to the loo every night. So it's funny how the body changes over time, and what we first do that makes us feel better isn't necessarily what we need to do several months later when things have changed in our body.
Well, and that's because your body's changed. And once again, when you talk about that plasma volume, your body's adjusted to that hormonally and enzymatically to where it's got the increased blood volume, but it's not shedding it. Like when you go low carb and you get that thing where you need the sodium, that goes back to that thing. All of a sudden, these stiff arteries have just gone from here, like here to there. So all of a sudden you don't feel it and you feel like woozy. And you feel them and your body's trying, it's still not adjusted hormonally. So all of a sudden you're going to the loo. And then as time goes on, you adjust, and you're still eating, but you're not scared of salt. You're just not eating heaps unless you're going out for a ride. And that's, you make a good point. When I'm talking about this, use a lot of salt when you're out there exercising and sweating a lot, just salt to taste, and do the normal thing and drink to thirst in your sedentary life. Right? Yeah. That's pretty much what you're saying you've adopted.
Yeah, easily. And to taste is an interesting thing as well, because there are times when salt won't taste as salty, and it will taste more salty. Your receptors will actually tell you if you need something, if you just put salt in your mouth.
Yeah, your receptors become sensitive to everything. It's like even your whole body. It's like you eat a big carb meal. It's like I'll have pizza, right, once in a while, and it's like an out of body experience. I'm watching myself just shoveling pizza in, right? And it's good while it's going on. Then an hour later, it's like, oh no, I shouldn't have done that. And it's like for 3 days you're feeling like terrible.
Yeah, that inflammation is a big part of it. Where basically a high carb diet does increase inflammation in many different ways. Whether it's the type of food that is carrying the carbohydrates or the carbohydrates themselves.
Yep.
But then that inflammation can actually cause an inability for the body to get oxygen where it needs to go, which reduces the ability to burn fat, which means you go more glycolytic, you burn more sugars at a lower heart rate more quickly, and you're stuck in this cycle, which is sort of, you can relate that to sort of chronic fatigue people or people with those chronic inflammation issues. They will feel lactic at a very low heart rate. And basically, because the oxygen's not getting where it needs to go, they can't burn the fat. They're using sugars all the time. And so they're detraining themselves when they do exercise. So give us a little bit more information about the inflammation, lack of oxygen, and the detraining aspects that can occur.
Well, it's kind of a complex mix, but when you have these layers of inflammation, you have the inflammation from too much glucose to begin with. So that stiffens those arteries, veins, and capillaries, right? So your blood pressure goes up, your ability to deliver goes down. And of course, then the muscles are reliant on more sugar to burn than fat. Your hormonal and enzymatic signaling gets pushed over towards more glucose burn. It's sort of a cascading effect, right? Mm-hmm. But I want to add a big hope of promise here, because what I've typically seen working with a lot of different athletes across age spectrums is when they get themselves physiologically fat adapted and start training, like I said, they get their base training, like we talked about, base training, then starting to incorporate really high intensity interval training and tempo work like into the mix, and get their aerobic fat metabolism up at that 75-80% of VO2 max crossover and high oxidation rate. That window of carbohydrate tolerance goes way up. And I've got young male athletes that are just like smashing the carbs, just like old school carb loading technique. And all it does is make them go fast, doesn't impact their fat burning one bit, but that's occasion. That's, it's not, they don't do that all the time. And as soon as they're in recovery, they go super low carb, reset themselves, and add in carbs very strategically, whether it's before or refeeding, based on the training and the training load and the conditions, right? And that window, when you get fat adapted and aerobically fit, that's two things, because a lot of the keto crowd, they like to do like CrossFit and strength and conditioning training and take pictures of their guns and their abs and all that. They're getting some aerobic fitness, but they're not optimizing it. And so they don't have that same window. Same thing with the body of research on keto. It's all based on it's almost all based on sedentary people, right? Right. So that's why it's very strict, that 50 grams and below, or sometimes 20 grams and below. When you're looking at, the more that aerobic fat-based physiology opens up, the bigger that tolerance to carbohydrates. So it makes the sustainability and the enjoyment of this kind of lifestyle so much better. You just have to be willing to train. And as you know, once you get into a training mode, you kind of like look forward to it, right? It sucks for the first 20 minutes but once you're in, you're in.
And then, because I've seen in other elite athletes that still incorporate a fair few carbohydrates, but they're very aerobically fit. They're elite athletes. They'll still have ketones after having, a beer and chips, which is not, obviously, it's not good food, and they're probably getting a ton of inflammation and response from the type of food. But let's say that they ate, just rice and potatoes, and but they were still having good ketone numbers because they'd put in, 5-6 hours of exercise for the day. At dinner time, they're still just shunting that glycogen very quickly into the muscles, and ketones stay up.
Yeah, and they do have some inflammation, and some oxidative stress, but it's not, because of their insulin sensitivity is so high, it's not nearly the level of somebody who's an athlete that would be on a chronic high carb athletic diet. And that's the thing. I mean, you're seeing some pushback from the high carb camp now, and they're showing exercise about how it doesn't work with keto. And it's not this. What gets me is, and this, you've got the keto camp here, you got the high carb camp here, and they're not in the middle. And I'm kind of saying, no, look, there's all these different things. And also another thing that's really important for the audience to understand is fat adaptation for performance is not about just the diet. There's so many factors that go into it. Magnesium, vitamin D, hydration, those are the kind of training you do. Those are 4 things I can name right off the top of my head, and there's others that are huge stress levels. There's 5 now. I mean, there's all these huge things that affect your ability to perform on fat, whereas, stress, all these things that I just named off. On a carbohydrate-based thing, carbohydrates still work great because, your body just has to burn them now.
And that's what I mentioned earlier when I said the people with chronic illness don't burn fat well, but you don't even have to have chronic illness to not be able to get the oxygen in to burn the fat well. It may just be, if you had a hard session the day before, which was a glycolytic session, burning sugars, and you've produced a lot of oxidative stress in the muscles and their cells, that is going to reduce your ability to burn fat the next day as well, just because of the stress load. And if you add in a late night sleep, some bunch of alcohol,
absolutely,
emotional stress, work stress, the hormonal response, the oxidative stress, the next day you aren't going to burn fat as well as you would have when you're really good. And that brings me to something I wanted to mention, give an example of and get your opinion of. So Mark Allen famously trained at MAF for a long time. But then when he obviously got very fit and fast at an aerobic level, but obviously in race day, he didn't stick to, his MAF heart rate, 180 minus his age, but he didn't need to. And something I've said for a long time is you're always better on race day. Don't go by the numbers and things on race day, because you're in peak shape of your life, like the best shape of your life, which also means there's the least amount of stress in your body on race day, which means you can perform at a higher level and still be aerobic.
That's right. That's right. And that's one of the things in the OFM program, when we talk about stress, I think that we humans have gotten too ensconced in our human man-made environment. And we're too proud to, and I'm not saying it's miraculous. I love data. I love to look at, but we've gotten so focused on data that people are looking at their power meters and their Garmins and seeing if they're where they are. It's like I said, I try to tell people, no, take the data, let's look at it afterwards and see what the trends are. And I want you to become intuitive, because on race day, I want you to just go out and fucking kill it. There's no other way to just go out there with the attitude, I'm going to go out and fucking kill it. Because that's what evolution did for us. We were meant to go out and hunt game. And you have to have that sort of like develop that intuitive sense as part of the whole fat metabolism. So you're not stressing, you have that quiet confidence, not the cocky confidence, but the quiet confidence to just know that you can go out and execute.
I love that.
On any given day, you just go out and execute. So I always tell us, I just go out and effing kill it. Yeah. Let's take data, let's look at it. But you should, by the time you get to that, exactly what you said, you should know in your heart of hearts where you are and what's going on, and be able to make those adjustments. Right. Yeah. And the other thing about fat adaptation that's really good for racing is when you become fat adapted, you become what I call blood sugar stable. And this has profound impacts. It's much more subtle. It's not something you can measure with quote unquote science, but people know it. They're more focused. They're more emotionally stable. So you're not having all these pre-race jitters. Yeah, you're excited, but you don't like overthink things, right? You just kind of have that intuitive thing going into a race. Okay, I'm going to do it. So you can get a decent night's sleep in the week leading up to your race. You can have that emotional stability that's going to put you in that peak physiological shape of your life. So you're peaking on race day. Yeah. Now, another thing, and you might want to incorporate this into your coaching. With fat adaptation, everything changes in terms of the training. And that's why the training is a big part of fat adaptation. Is I don't do, especially for like Ironman and ultras, like the 100-mile ultras and more, I don't do a taper per se. I do a, what I call disruptive periodization, but then after that peak build period, we go into a big recovery period, and then I do what's called a modified build instead of tapering, because you build back up to where you're peaking on race day, because I find that athletes get stale if they're in a big taper for ultra endurance. Because the shift in fat, if you're doing high carb, you do have to do a taper, because when you go through your peak build phase, there's so much cumulative oxidative stress. You need that 2 weeks just to recover, right? Whereas you don't need that. I mean, I had a guy I was coaching 3 years ago, and he was doing the Triple Crown of hundreds and then another 250-mile race after that. So he did 4 over 200-mile races in less than 4 months. And because he was active military and his doctor found out about it, she was like, no, you're not supposed to be doing this. So she was taking his blood work before and after every race, because if there was any changes, she was going to tell him he couldn't do it, because technically you're damaging government property. Anyway, that never happened because his blood work never changed, right? And he was doing over 200 miles. The last 2 were 250-mile races. He got stronger as he went. So 2 weeks after the first one, he set a PR, a PB, and the 5K, 10K a mile. And then after the third one, he did 250 miles in the mountains of Moab, Utah. 5 days later, he ran a 23-minute PB at the marathon, the Marine Corps marathon. Just 5 days later, ran a 3:21 marathon. The guy's not even built like a runner. He's built like a Marine. Stocky, doesn't look like an endurance athlete. And then he did the Okinawa survival run. He was the first foreigner to ever finish this 250-mile run around Okinawa in heat and humidity. One sleep cycle, less than 40 hours after doing that, he did the Marine Corps PT, scored a perfect 300. So I'm just illustrating that the recovery as a whole, because when you reduce that oxidative stress down to nothing, which of course you're experiencing, the recovery is so much better. And instead of trying to recover back to baseline, right, and have a little bit of an improvement, the body doesn't have the exit, so it's using more of that impact of the stress to get stronger. So that the hormesis, the adaptive stress, the body gets stronger, fitter. And I think a lot of it is what goes back to that mitochondrial biogenesis.
And so that leads into like why he was able to perform. His energy production was not inhibited by accumulative stress. So can I just get your definition, I guess, of energy? Like, because everybody says energy and some people totally misuse it and say, you know, basically, oh, I needed energy, so I ate some more glucose. And, you know, that they're two totally different things, because energy is demand driven. And it's also based on the ability to produce energy from, you know, such as from accumulative stress, reducing the ability to produce energy. So, yeah, what is energy in your mind?
Well, you make a very good point in terms of training and racing right there. You really have me thinking there. As you go along in a big race, that oxidative stress is impacting that ability to produce energy because of its impact on your mitochondria and your Krebs cycle. And so, like, if you can reduce that down to a fraction, it's like we were talking about in the back end of your race, you got something in the tank and can keep going. And then, you know, yeah, you can throw a little, you know, gasoline of glucose onto the fire to stoke it. I mean, yes, you have some fatigue. I'm not, you know, nobody's saying it doesn't happen, but compared to somebody who's been burning 300-400 calories an hour or trying to, right, in an Ironman race, it's a whole different thing. And people need to make that paradigm shift, because we've been sold and told this idea we need external calories, and people have totally forgotten the fact that we've got thousands of calories on us, not just the fat, but the glycogen. And glycogen is our fight or flight fuel, and we have this robust supply. Problem is the modern science has focused on that as our main supply, and it never was meant to be that. It's that little reserve we need to give us that extra push when we're surging to pass somebody, you know, we're hunting people down in Ironman. And that, along with some external calories, will give us that extra performance, but that base fuel load should come from our fat stores.
Yeah. And what you mentioned earlier, the bit I loved about, you've got to go into the race with that quiet confidence of, you know, I can kill this. And that also helps the ability at the back end of the race, because confidence is going to keep your nervous system lower. You're not going to use up those hormones like adrenaline, and the things that help you with pain tolerance and motivation is also going to be able to kick in.
Absolutely. And that's where, again, when you look at the sympathetic, parasympathetic nerve system, the adrenal response, the cortisol, those are meant to be used occasionally, right? They're not meant to be used all the time. In our modern world, the way we're being pinged, as I say it, the way we're being pinged by, you know, pinging on our phone of a text coming in or a notification, and we're supposed to keep track of our power, our output, our glucose, and trying to consciously keep track of all this stuff that we're never meant to keep up. Like, we're supposed to get into that, you know, as Mark Allen and Phil Maffetone have talked about, that zone, the zone, and get into that zone and go. And it's a compilation of taking these tools, these conscious human tools, and leveraging them into that intuitive athlete, right? And that's based on that fat burning physiology. I mean, that's like I say, you know, several million years of evolution wasn't wrong. I mean, the reason we carry the extra fat is that's what our aerobic energy is supposed to be predicated on using, and glycogen is our fight or flight, and we're made robust, so we have plenty on board. But when you have this situation where we're trying to overthink things, we've taken ourselves out of that natural environment. And, you know, we want to use the adrenal stuff, the cortisol, for when we need it, right? And then that'll tap into the glycogen stores and give us that adrenaline for when we need it to push. But we've just, you know, burned ourselves out by using the energy supplies that we're not meant to use chronically.
Just a couple more questions. Won't keep you much longer. It's been unreal. Oh, it's been so good. Aerobic deficiency syndrome, the phrase that Phil Maffetone coined decades and decades ago. Can you explain what you see in your athletes how you've kind of got them through it and some of the progression of what you've seen from changing diet and training approaches.
Well, it goes back, like if people, listen to this thing, we've talked about a lot of them. It goes to your mitochondria. It goes to that cardiovascular system, getting the lungs, the veins, arteries, capillaries, microcapillaries in the kind of shape where they can deliver maximum oxygen. It's like why wouldn't you want to optimize the system that feeds your muscles, right, first, so that you can deliver the energy, oxygen in, get the CO2 and waste products and heat out before you start working on getting the muscles, because by doing that, you're going to generate more mitochondria. And by using whole foods, fat adapted strategy, you're going to give your body all those building blocks, right, to build more healthier cells, more robust mitochondria, so you can have more, bigger, larger, so that you can, handle more oxygen. So you're not in that deficit. You're not burning you're not creating the oxidative stress that's literally burning up the mitochondria and creating that hypoxic unit. I read a wonderful paper on what they call these super complexes in mitochondria, and how there's these 5 different super complexes within the mitochondria. And then what happens is they start to fold when they sense a hypoxic. There's these enzymes that sense a hypoxic load, and then they change in order to adapt. And it's the same thing as you see with how the same proteins also fold in heat adaptation. There's 2 or 3 weeks of heat adaptation where your cell proteins start to fold in different ways to adapt to the stress of extra heat, right? And so the body is pretty remarkable in doing that. You just have to allow it to do that. And like I said, when you're burning glucose, it's a fight or flight fuel. So all of a sudden it's like the lion has jumped out of the bush, or you've got the other tribe chasing you to come kill you and rape your women, take your women and children as slaves. And so when that happens, you drop everything else to deal with the immediate thing. And that's what glucose sort of does. And it's great for that top end racing fuel. But if you do this kind of crisis management, you impede all those other processes. You don't stop them, because like I said, we're always burning fat. It's just, are we doing it optimally or not?
Yeah. And we're always using glucose and fat at the same time, always.
Right.
So have you seen that classic high heart rate, but the heart rate basically has no aerobic ability. It as soon as someone starts to walk almost or jog, it shoots straight up to well above MAF heart rate. Have you seen some of your people have come to you and seen huge improvements? Well,
yes, in general, but it's kind of an interesting thing. Like you notice it, like say you didn't sleep or you're stressed about something and you've been having caffeine, you go out and try and do a workout, and it's like, even somebody like you, if you didn't get sleep and you're on caffeine and something happened, you go out and try to do a workout, and then boom, your heart rate goes up, right? At the same time, what we've also seen, once you're physiologically fat adapted, because remember, when Phil was working with people like Mark Allen, Stu Middleman, Mike Pigg, back in the 80s and 90s, his approach, he was working with high caliber athletes who were already, just by training, had a pretty good level of fat adaptation. And he didn't make the same dietary shifts or anything like that, because it was a different time. There wasn't a need to. So his idea of low carb back then was going from processed grains to whole grains. I have his first edition books. And so the maffetone training worked really well. But what we found is when you get really seriously physiologically fat adapted, when you do like tempo work, like at that MAF maximum, we actually see the heart rate go up. The MAF has to be adjusted 10 to 20 beats more.
So the maximum heart rate increases.
Yeah. The maximum heart rate increases. And I think that's a function of what we would call physiological age. So what I've seen, the tendency is that like younger guys in their 20s and earlier 30s, that adjustment is much smaller, if at all. They're more on that, that 180 minus your age for like math works well for them. But as you get into the 30s, 40s, and 50s, all of a sudden you need to add 10 or 15 beats, because I've seen, I did this, oh gosh, way back in the early 2000s with some athletes, and I'd find they just plateau. And even now I still see this. They'll go hard keto, start doing math training, and after 2 or 3 weeks, they're just walking any slight hill on a run. They're walking it, or just because they can't, their heart rate, their standard 180 minus their age with adjustments just doesn't work. And as soon as we move it up 10 to 20 beats a minute, depending on the factors, boom, they start to be able to train well. They keep seeing those increases in pace or power at the same heart rate. So I think that's due to the increase in that arterial distensibility, that flexibility in the thing, because you don't have that. The cardiovascular system is a closed loop system, hydraulic system. Okay, so the heart is a pump, right? And if you have that tense things like on hard carb, the heart rate's kind of limited, but once you relax it, it picks up a different cadence. Like how cadence is important in running and on the bike. It's picking up a higher cadence because there's less back pressure to slow the heart down. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I've also heard a few theories that the heart isn't necessarily the pump. There's also other factors of energy, this unseen, untestable energy, which can actually be helping the blood circulate the way that it circulates, and the heart itself is not doing 100% of the work. So that connects with what you're saying, as the veins change, as the mitochondria get healthier, their information of what they're meant to be doing and how they work to move blood also improves. So it's not just the heart.
Yes, exactly. And that's the problem, is when we're talking about conscious thought in science, we're trying to keep track of too many things, and we can't. So everybody focuses on one thing. So they focus on the heart, or they focus on the diet, or they focus on a certain modality of training, and they don't look at this big moving dynamic matrix, as I call it, which is what the human body is. I mean, biological systems work this way. And as a biologist, I look at the human. I look at the human in terms of how it exists in the food chain or in the environment, or look at, like, I don't know, the other day I was looking at, things in the Central Valley and the cropping systems and how it used to be. And, the
sun, and you mentioned the sun at the very start. I mean, how we exist on Earth and how we relate to everything.
Absolutely. It all comes from that energy of the sun and how it cycles from the plants and the bacteria and the algae into the food chain and creates this cycle of energy. And how we, even though we depend on that for food for most of our energy, we actually also take in energy from the sun and convert it to vitamin D and other compounds. Yeah. I mean, when you look at vitamin D, which is important, you read the things like Michael Hollick, who's the foremost expert researcher on vitamin D. He says there's at least 10 other compounds we don't know about that are produced by sunlight from the sunlight, vitamin D. And it's just an amazing journey. And that's another thing. When you get that sweat rate and your pores open, the fat, and also the fat adaptation, what I've noticed is my skin, I don't wear sunscreen and I don't wear a shirt unless I'm at altitude, and I don't burn. My skin
I'm the same too.
It's just amazing. And this is consistent from the athletes I work with, just how much better their skin tone is and how well it's preserved.
And then you are going to absorb vitamin D and convert it into all these elements that we need much better, because your skin and cells are working better to do that conversion. And
and those, for years, I mean, they're talking about it now in relation to this COVID-19 thing, because low vitamin D is synonymous with really bad outcomes of COVID. But I've been talking about vitamin D for years, because that was one of the first things I identified was vitamin D and magnesium are two things that unless somebody's actively pursuing maintaining their vitamin D and magnesium, they're going to be deficient in that. And for an athlete, the standard medical reference range, which is 30 to 100, I don't remember what it is in millimolars, but that standard reference range is not good. Anything below 50 for an athlete is deficient. I've just always seen that in terms of performance. It's a big one.
Yeah,
it's just,
nitric oxide's really related.
Absolutely,
isn't it?
Yeah.
And that helps to carry the oxygen and do all sorts of things. So,
and that's a multifactorial thing. I mean, you see a lot of focus on the Beat Elite and the alt red products, which do have an effect. The little blue pill for men is another
beetroot juice and
right. I also use a product called Mother Dirt. They don't pay me anything, but it's called motherdirt.com, and it's a bacteria that's endemic in the environment. I mean, it's in our environment. We've literally cleansed our bodies off of it.
Because Mother Dirt is a soap, isn't it?
Well, no.
It's actually
a bacteria. It's a bacteria. It's literally a bacteria.
You use it to wipe on your body as
you actually inoculate your body with it. Okay, and then that bacteria exists on your skin just like it does on other animals' skin, and it actually takes the ammonia that's coming off your sweat and converts it into nitric oxide. So when I'll do an inoculation once every couple of weeks. So, I'll put it on me, and I'll also inhale it through my nostrils to inoculate my nasal cavity with it. And that ammonia gets converted to nitric oxide, and it makes your skin breathe even better. And it's just amazing. But again, it's just like going from high carb to high fat. In terms of hygiene, going from this idea of using all these shampoos and cleansers to inoculating yourself with a bacteria, right?
Yeah.
And then just rinsing off or using their soap, which won't affect the bacteria because, this, like I say, this bacteria is endemic in the environment, but it's easily washed off and it doesn't compete as well as other bacteria and fungi growing on your skin.
Particularly with the way that we use this type of soaps that we use. And
exactly. It's just our modern man-made environment has kind of got us off track. And all I'm trying to do is just kind of get us back on track with a little help from some man-made things.
Yeah. So talking about that, that's what Vespa is trying to do. Just give us a bit of a how to use it.
Okay, so Vespa's been around for 20 years, and I've been doing fat adaptation for about 20 years, kind of pioneered it in the new millennia. I mean, actually, Phil Maffetone was out pursuing a music career, and when people started performing on fat, that's when he got sucked back into the vortex. I don't know if you knew that, but Phil's a huge musician. The guy's literally a Renaissance man.
Yeah, I mean, he lived with Johnny Cash.
Yeah, and recorded with a lot of other real famous musicians.
He lived with Rick Rubin as well. Like he's helped some amazing. People.
Yeah. So he was like totally. I'm friends with him, and he was totally immersed in this music career. And then when people started to see these athletes doing on this crazy fat-based thing, people started remembering Phil and started pulling back into the thing. But Vespa has also been around for 20 years, and it's literally an accidental discovery of nature. So back in I can't remember if it was the late 80s or early 90s, some Japanese entomologists were studying this giant wasp, which has made the news recently. They're called the murder hornet. So with all the things going on, the murder hornet still made the news. So it's this hornet they were studying, and it's literally the apex predator of the insect world. Okay. And they started studying it, and they're like, this thing can fly 50, 70, 100 kilometers a day. It goes and attacks prey, sometimes many times its size, and then masticates it into a food ball that weighs about 30% of its body weight, then flies back to the colony, feeds it to the larva. It's like, holy crap, what makes it be able to do this? I mean, it's like in terms of performance, strength, it's like a, it's like these elite special forces guys on steroids. Okay. And so bees, wasps, ants, and termites have this symbiotic relationship called Trophallaxis, which is between two life stages. So this adult wasp, which is the largest insect that does this, it feeds the food to the larva, which can eat a solid food. And in exchange for that food ball, the larva give it this peptide that they secrete that activates it to be able to access all the fat stored in its thorax for high level performance, right? Because flying, fighting and killing prey and then taking it back it combines endurance with strength, right? And so they're like, oh, and then what they deduced in thinking about this is saying, well, animal cells are remarkably similar across species, and if you're a biologist, you know this. Cell biology across animal species, the cells are like 90 some odd percent the same.
We're even about 60% the same as bananas. So
yeah, exactly. I mean, this is the cycle of life, right? And evolution. And so they theorized that this could work in other animal cells. So they started playing with rats and mice and doing swimming tests to exhaustion. Sure enough, it worked. So then they incorporated it with humans and showed it worked. So there's a couple of papers. There's some the papers aren't very good. That's why I don't really post them, because I understand what good science is, and it's I don't want to post schlocky science. So but anyway, that's what Vespa does. It's a catalyst. People have to think of it as a catalyst, not calories. Because people pick up a thing of Vespa and look at it and says 18 calories. This is a gimmick, because they just don't understand, because we've been sold and told this idea you need these external calories rather than use this as a catalyst to tap into the thousands of calories you have on board. Yeah. Right.
Okay. So that comes to what we were saying before about there's so many pathways for fuel, for energy. There's so many different types of fuel for energy that if this can fill in those gaps a little bit, like it's needed to warm up, as you're saying, you need to warm up before the fat becomes optimal fat burning. You don't just flick a switch and things happen the same way the entire time. Even if you keep the same heart rate at an aerobic level, over time, things will accumulate. Like nothing stays the same. So
it's dynamic.
So this is just an extra little fill in the gap that helps that process work a little bit better.
And I have a researcher who's conducting a double-blind placebo crossover study, but it got interrupted by COVID, right? So we're going to pick it up again this summer when school starts for him. But unpublished data so far, that it's unpublished, but anywhere from 0.5 gram to a full gram a minute increase in fat oxidation with Vespa. Some people even see a VO2 max increase, right?
Well, you're still aerobic at VO2 max. I mean,
you're still burning,
using oxygen to create energy.
Right. It's never one or the other until you get to VO2 max, and then VO2 max, and even at VO2 max, there's been some papers suggesting the pathways that the sugar burning covers up of the little bit of fat burning that's still going on. But one athlete I've worked with, Jeff Browning, he's 48 and he's one of the top 100-mile trail ultra specialists in the sport. He's tested out at 2.22 grams a minute of peak fat oxidation, which is just unheard of. Like before the faster study, the science suggested that the peak fat oxidation an athletic human could do was up to 1 gram a minute, and most people would burn between 1/2 and 3/4 of a gram a minute if they were a well conditioned athlete, right? Faster changed all that with 1.54 grams a minute average, and John Rutherford was one of the athletes who I worked closely with. He recorded 1.79, no Vespa, just straight keto. So 1.79 grams a minute. Jeff Browning, he went from 1.23 grams a minute fasted to 2.22 grams a minute fasted with Vespa.
Which is a great point to hit home to people, that aerobic capacity is not a heart rate. It's not attached to the heart rate. Heart rate is a guide, but aerobic capacity is something that is totally different. And it goes by, as you said earlier, you can feel it. You need to get in touch with how it feels, your breathing, your mindset. You can feel what's going on. But to get up to 2.2, he's able to demand a huge amount of energy through his muscles and still be burning mostly fat.
Right. And that
his heart rate will be much higher, but what's going on at the muscle level will be that maximum aerobic function.
That's exactly right. And that sets the stage for he's like last year at Western States, he ran the fastest split in the last 38 miles of the race. And you had a guy who 29 years old, Jim Walmsley, who won the race and has set records. The guy's phenomenal. He was racing another guy. He wasn't just coasting in the lead. He had a guy chasing him. So he was racing too. And this is a guy, these are a couple of late 20 guys, top of the sport. And then Jeff is 47 years old, and he was 9th or 10th. He was in that top 10. And there were three or four guys racing in that back, chasing each other. But his last 38 miles were the fastest of all those top 10 people by a long shot. And that's kind of telling about like what we were talking about earlier of like, how are you going to be able to perform in the back half of your race?
How do you produce the most amount of energy or have the demand for the energy able to ask for it to be produced without that fatigue?
And that's where, as that's where Ironmans are won or lost, right?
Oh, yeah. It's the last person to slow down wins most of the time. Most of the time, I mean, you look at Hawaii, and I mean, really, the winner has a great day, and pretty much everyone else has like a just slightly off their best.
That's right.
You rarely see a race in Hawaii where there's 5 guys that have all come. They would all cross the finish line and say, "Wow, I had a perfect race. I was able to push to the end."
Like that dude, like the Mark Allen. What was it? The Mark Allen and what's
Dave
the guy?
Scott.
Dave Scott duel in the sun thing. It's kind of funny because I actually was going to university at Davis when Dave Scott was living there. And a friend of mine used to be his next door neighbor, and they used to go out for runs together. It's kind of.
I love that Dave Scott is now so behind the benefits of low carb that he's really on the end of the scale. Well, that he's promoting how good it is now. It's great.
Yeah. It's great to hear this, and it's like in these times, I really admire people like Dave Scott and Tim Noakes because, they're sort of like the political leaders of this movement because they're latecomers, but to have the balls to say, hey, I was wrong about this. We need to make a change. We need more leaders who have that kind of skill set to say, hey, wait a second, maybe I overshot this. And
understand that they are going to polarize people. And I know things that I say polarize people, but I mean, Dave Scott's position to be polarizing people who, the majority of the triathlon community still believe that carbs, especially the higher profile people, most of the elites will still say, no, I need carbohydrates to perform well, and I need to eat a lot of them. So he's going against the grain of his entire community, or the majority of the community, and polarizing people. So it's fantastic.
Yeah, it is. And it's kind of sad because what you just said, it's like, it's frustrating because, you talk about polarizing. I've polarized a lot of people because I started talking about this from 2000 and I've been blasted by Jason Koop, who works for Carmichael Training Systems, and, Louise Burke and Chris. I mean, it's just like when I was really starting to really get this going, because I didn't know better. I didn't know that you weren't supposed to do this. And, in 2006, Louise Burke was saying, we got to put the nail on the coffin about this fat stuff. This is ridiculous. And Chris Carmichael was saying, it's about the carbs, and they still do, right? And you have to, I don't know, it's one of these things where you got to push. And, you know, I've been polarizing people for a long time, and people thought I was kooky because I'm not Dave Scott. I'm not Mark Allen or Phil Maffetone. I'm just this guy who figured it out and started to get a lot of really high caliber athletes in a niche sport to perform well. And then we've had people like, I've worked with Olympic gold medalists in swim, which is that's interesting because, you know, swimming is a glycolytic sport, right? The competitions are glycolytic, but yet the training is highly aerobic because there's no way you're going to spend 3, 4, 5 hours in a pool at glycolytic levels, right?
But I love that you can still, in a 100-meter event, which is the second shortest event in swimming, you can still go out too hard and blow up too early. I can't remember how quick the females swim, but I mean, we're talking like less than a minute, far less than a minute. You can still go out too hard. It's amazing.
Yeah. And I was able to successfully help an athlete with that. And then the other thing that's interesting is Vespa is being used by some men's figure skaters. And a men's figure skating is 4 minutes long. And this goes back to that mental focus and retention of motor skills, because your blood sugar is stable, because that's all, you know, it's less than 4 minutes. But again, like swimming, the ice skating, they train for hours, right? But in figure skating, it's not like swimming where you can train for 3 or 4 hours. When somebody's training for figure skating, the coach is watching them closely, because as soon as they get sloppy, they got to pull them off the ice, because they'll either do the move wrong or they'll hurt themselves. And so these athletes who've won Olympic gold medals, I've worked with them, they are able to stay on that ice practicing longer. So they use the Vespa for their performance, but it's really in the training, because you can just work on your moves to where you just got them down. And once again, it goes back to that quiet confidence that you just know you can go out on the ice and just execute.
And that lack of that lower oxidative stress buildup.
Right. Absolutely.
So recovery is quicker.
They just
information transfers better. Adaptation's better in so many aspects.
Yeah. And you can handle a higher training load.
Yeah.
You know, yeah. So it's just fat adaptation. It doesn't, I think what people miss is like I say, most people want to look at what's right in front of them, right? The shotgun approach. Yeah. And the thing about fat adaptation is the real benefits are sort of behind the scenes going on. They put you in a place where you can sustainably perform at a high level for a long time. So yeah, that's kind of what it is. And, you know, we've seen,
but as you said, it's a holistic approach. You can't be totally stressed at work and have high cortisol all day and then think, oh, if I just train at low heart rate for 2 months, I'm going to therefore be really fat adapted at the end of it. I mean, you will get better, but your progress is going to be much slower if you chuck in poor sleep, stress, and these other factors.
Right. And it may never be as good as a high carb diet on that.
Yeah.
If you're stressed out all the time. And the problem is if you're doing a high carb diet,
it's better for your health still. It's still going to be better for health.
You'll be better, but you won't be optimal. And it's like I'll share something with you. Like I work with a lot of athletes over the years, and this holistic approach includes looking at them as an individual, because again, the modern construct is to commoditize individuals into groups, right? And then commoditize the product and service you're selling, because that's how you make money, through repeating. But people are individuals. I mean, we're all our own special snowflake, but we're all the same. We're all different, right? Yeah. So the point I want to make is with the stress, you know, a lot of athletes I work with, you know, there'll just be something, I'll sense something in the background, and you know, over time they'll feel comfortable and things will get shared that are in their childhood or certain traumas or something going on in their work or relationship life. And you know, unless those things are developed, you can't burn fat. You can be really good on sugar for a short term, but all these things add up, and people need to realize they're individuals. They need to be treated like one, but as an individual, there's not this one size fits all silver bullet type approach. They're going to have to do the work as much as, say, I as a coach, or you as a coach, or some product or service. There's a lot of work to be done to get there, and it's we're hooked on convenience. And like you were saying before about these high-end profiles needing carbs, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm digressing a little bit here, but I'm sorry, but when they go into that I need my carbs thing, I'm thinking you're an addict and you don't even know it.
Yeah, because it's the dopamine hits, the emotional attachments, the memories,
the physiology, the physiological impacts that your body constantly. It's like,
but as we've said, it can work, and people can perform well in a very high stressed state where they're pumping adrenaline all day, every day, where they're eating carbohydrates all day, every day. It can work, but when we're looking at the overall picture, particularly when it comes to endurance sports, that accumulative stress of hours that you need to put in back-to-back days, and then in the race itself, the accumulative stress, and then you're talking about after the race, after your career, after you want to be healthy, you want a long, healthy life. And so we're not saying we're not telling people that you can't perform on carbohydrates. We're just saying there are so many other factors to performance that and lifestyle and health that can benefit from and let me frame it just a little different way. It's what you're saying is absolutely true, because it's like I say to people, it's not a question of if you're going to have a problem on a diet high in chronic concentrated carbohydrates. It's when and what form. Right. And it just your body sees it as sugar, glucose, right? And so people need to understand that, because they know sugar is bad, because so many high carb athletes, they say, oh, complex carbohydrates or vegetables, or like their gel is made from fruit. And it's like your body sees it as sugar. And it's like, and you're also deficient in nutrients when you do eat the high carb stuff. And you mentioned earlier stress fractures or a bone issue when sodium is leached out. But you'll also get that if you're eating a high carb diet, because you're not eating nutrient dense proteins. Like if you're eating more carbohydrates that leach nutrients from your bones, such as proteins and sodiums. And then you're also not eating the nutrient dense foods that will replace those issues. I mean, this cycle of issue. And as you said, there are so many ways that this can show up from sort of stress fractures to muscle tightness and problems, or tendon issues. Like inflammation will present itself, and mental issues, and right through to just general aches and pains. And people just, people who aren't even athletes, who hit 30 and start to feel terrible, go, oh, well, they go to their doctor, and the doctor just says, well, you're getting old. That's just part of it. Your back's going to get sore now. And it's like, I've got a client who's 50, and within a month or 2 weeks of going, he was already a bit low carb, but for him, he went carnivore.
Right.
And so cutting out all lectins, and gluten is a lectin. So we all know, if I go gluten-free, I feel better. But some people need to cut out all lectins, and I'm the same. And his back pain went away because the inflammation dropped.
That's right. That's right. And those things are huge. I mean, they're just huge. And like my mind's spinning, because there's so many things to think about in this, and it's great. But, like one of the other thing I think the audience needs to know is, like, when you
wrap it up with some last points.
In terms of the nutrition dietary side, when you get that nutritional balance, I'm not looking at the nutritional density so much as the balance. OFM, we look at the nutritional balance. When you get that balance just right, and I like to have almost all my athletes on what I call whole animal eating, which means muscle meat, skin and connective tissue and organ meat. So most white people, I'm going to be racist prejudice here in the reverse, but most modern first world people won't eat organ meat and skin and connective tissue. Most traditional cultures, that's part of their culture. They eat all this stuff. So you need to have that balance. And so for high level athletes, there is supplementation. But what I've found is when you get that nutritional balance just right in your diet, and it can be a mix of animal products and plant products. I'm not anti-plant here, but it's simply amazing. It never ceases to amaze me how little you need, how good you perform, and how good you feel on really very little if you get that balance dialed in. So I'm always a less is more person. It's not that on race day you're not going to be pushing some Vespa and pushing some carbs, but it's going to be a fraction of what you need. And even during training, you're not, like a lot of the carnivore community, people are bragging about how many kilos of meat they eat a day. And I'm like, that's crazy because, unless you're a 18-year-old kid trying to bodybuild, you just don't need that much protein, right?
Or you don't need that much of anything, really.
You don't. But if you're eating, say, half a kilo or a little over a half a kilo plus some liver capsules or liver and mixing in the collagen, those things plus some vegetables, and your stomach and gut is in good shape, it's amazing how little you need. Now, and just to close up, one of the thought patterns I've had really lately is on the whole collagen gelatin thing. I mean, gelatin, collagen, protein makes up about roughly a third of the proteins in our body. And I don't think people get enough of that. And the supplements out there, they're great. They're way better than nothing, but it's nothing like having the food that a lot of traditional cultures eat. I've really gotten a lot bigger on the collagen, especially for stomach and gut health, ligaments, tendons, myofascial sheath, all those things. And it just seems like my N of one and some of the athletes I'm working with, by getting regular feedings of these collagen-rich dishes, it's really had a positive impact, really a big positive impact. It makes your stomach and gut much more robust. We'll talk about it later in your aspect to you, but those are the closing.
As we mentioned earlier, the collagen is going to help the skin cells. You're going to get the vitamin D production,
absolutely,
and all the other things through as well.
Your nails, your hair, but even your internal organs, your stomach and gut lining, your soft tissue, all those things are made largely of collagen type proteins.
Bones.
Yeah, bones. And so the ligaments, the tendons, the myofascial sheath that keeps the muscle formed, all those things are collagen. So I think that people don't get enough collagen, but it's not as simple a thing as just supplementing with a bunch of collagen, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, real food is always, our body is going to process it like it can process the sun and oxygen. These are real things, and
several million and several million years of evolution can't be wrong, right? Whereas we've only had a couple hundred years of our modern man-made cleverness, shall I say?
and we haven't done very well with that cleverness so far.
Oh God, we've gotten ourselves so far off track, and your journey's been a perfect example, and you're getting back on that natural track, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
It's like to finish up. It's like you say, we're not saying you can't perform on a high carb diet, because you've obviously shown it that you can, and win a championship on it. But you've also shown that it comes with some really big consequences that aren't worth it. And you're finding that, oh, wait a second, I can perform as good, if not better, on a different approach. So it's based on metabolizing fat.
It's that easy.
Yeah, well,
thank you.
It actually is that easy, but it's complex, but the actual execution of it is actually pretty easy once you understand the principles.
Yeah, and we've talked about a lot of complex things, but at the end of the day, all these complex things are just the natural processes that go on with natural food, and an evolutionary aspect. Like, you just look at things in the big picture.
Yep.
You know, what were we doing a long time ago? You know, you ate when you got hungry, or when you found food, you ate. And you know,
and you didn't, and when you ate, you didn't try to train. Same thing. You don't try to eat when you're training.
Yeah,
right.
You didn't need to. If you needed to hunt something for a couple of hours, you could comfortably do it. And then you would then feast, and then you wouldn't eat till tomorrow when you hunted again.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, there's so much. But it's been.
So yeah, it's like breaking it down and talking about it to understand it. It's very complex. It's dynamic, as we said, but at the end of the day, it's really quite simple, and it's part of getting, you know, the athlete back to that intuitive state. So even in just executing in life, you have that quiet confidence to execute in life, and then on race day, it's like go out and, you know what, kill it.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
Wonderful.
Everything comes together on race day if you've practiced mindset, nutrition, the training, everything. Just keeping that fat metabolism optimized. This has been unreal, taking up plenty of your time. It's been awesome. So good. Thanks so much, Peter Defty from Vespa for coming on to talk to us.
You're my pleasure. Let's do this again soon.
Oh, it's been invaluable. It's been so cool. Listeners are going to love it. And yeah, I definitely loved it. It's been
and if the audience wants to hear on specific topics like we talk about, you know, we could, you know, if they could just chime in and tell us what they want to hear about, we'll have a conversation about that. And I think the conversation modality is really good because I like having this interaction with you, because you as a practicing triathlete, you know, this interaction makes it really dynamic. It's not me preaching something.
How do we put it in practical?
How do we make it work, you know, and how you've adopted this way and how it works in the real life of and training.
And the questions that pop up when you're out there and going, hang on, where am I getting the energy from? What is energy? You know, they're the things that I think of.
Yeah, but it's kind of interesting too, right? Because you found that, like, wow, I don't need all this stuff, and when I do use it, it really like gives me a boom. But it's like I can go out on any day and do a hard training session before breakfast and kill it.
Yeah, awesome.
Super.
Thanks so much. We will do it again. We'll get listeners to send in questions, and that would be awesome to have you on again. And
we'll push it out there on our stuff.
Yeah, fantastic.
Okay.
Thanks very much,
Pete.
Peter. Thank you.
You're welcome.